At exactly 11:58 p.m., beneath the Capitol dome, in a room with no windows and just one flickering bulb, a closed-door meeting was called. Inside, Nancy Pelosi leaned toward an aide and whispered 14 words she thought would never leave that room. But one mic, forgotten, still live, captured it all. And on the other end of that moment stood Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, young, unshaken, and about to ignite something no party leader saw coming. By sunrise, the words were everywhere. The nation was listening. Congress stood still. And for the first time in decades, a single sentence didn't just shake the walls of power, it cracked them wide open. What happens when the old guard forgets the mic is still on, and the next generation is done being polite? This is a fictional dramatization, but the questions it raises and the emotions it stirs are deeply real, because sometimes the only way to tell the truth is through a story. Inside sat 12 people, senior House Democrats, hands folded, jackets off, ties loosened, but eyes razor sharp. A faint hum came from the ceiling vent. Someone coughed, and then the door creaked again. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped in. She wasn't late, she was timed. Dressed in midnight blue, her coat still damp from the storm outside, she scanned the room. No smiles, just glances. Some bored, some bothered. One, barely, nodded. Nancy Pelosi, seated at the head of the table, didn't look up at first. She was circling numbers on a printout with a capped pen. Polling results, bleak ones, the kind that didn't get released publicly. The kind that meant phone calls had been made. Donors had gotten nervous, and the machine, the real one, was groaning. AOC, Pelosi finally said, as if reading off a guest list. Thank you for joining us. The young congresswoman gave the faintest nod. Her tone was composed, but her eyes were scanning everything. There was a legal pad at each seat, water bottles lined up, no coffee, no snacks. This wasn't a discussion. This was an operation. Pelosi stood. The room straightened reflexively. She tapped the document in her hand. The numbers are worse than we expected, she began. Swing seniors are bleeding. Independents are drifting. We are not losing votes. We are losing control of the conversation. A silence fell. Then in the second row, Representative Cohen chuckled under his breath. Or maybe the conversation is losing control of us, he muttered. Pelosi didn't blink. The immigration healthcare amendment scheduled for next Tuesday, she continued, must be pulled. We can't afford to look soft on border issues 3 months out. Not now. AOC's pen stopped moving. She didn't speak. Not yet. But her stillness was loud, like a wire stretched too tight. Another member chimed in. We promised that vote, Nancy. We promised survival, Pelosi snapped. No vote is worth the House. That's when AOC looked up. Not defiant, not rebellious, just direct. If the people who elected us no longer see themselves in our votes, what are we surviving for? A pause, not a dramatic one, a dangerous one. A junior rep 2 seats down shifted uncomfortably. Someone tapped a pencil nervously. The divide in the room wasn't subtle, it was generational. The older reps held posture like armor. The younger ones observed, careful not to draw fire. Pelosi's eyes didn't move from AOC, but her tone cooled. Idealism, she said, is useful until it costs seats. That sentence floated. AOC didn't respond. She didn't have to. Somewhere above them, the Capitol's ancient heating kicked in with a metallic rattle. Below it, an aide reached for a mic switch embedded in the table. Blinking red. The mic didn't turn off, but no one noticed. Not yet. She stayed standing at the head of the table, the polling packet still in her hand like a piece of evidence no one could refute. Here's the reality, she said, voice level but firm. The immigration healthcare amendment is polling at -12 with undecided seniors. We cannot afford to look reckless, especially not now. The Senate will never take it up anyway, and pushing it forward only gives the other side another bat to swing at us with. She paused and looked around the table. Here's what we're doing. We delay the floor vote, let it fall off the calendar. We push the jobs package into the spotlight, reframe the week, control the story. The aides sitting along the wall behind the lawmakers said nothing. Some stared at tablets. Others stared at nothing at all. AOC didn't blink. Pelosi continued, and if asked, we call it procedural. A simple rescheduling. We redirect the talking points. Easy pivot. Inflation, wages, infrastructure. That word, redirect, landed in AOC's gut like a cold coin. She set her pen down carefully, then spoke. Respectfully, Madam Speaker, she began, tone even. This amendment wasn't just a promise. It's a lifeline. For thousands of undocumented families working in frontline healthcare, during a pandemic we all made speeches about. She glanced around. Delaying it doesn't just shift priorities. It sends a message that when the storm passes, they're expendable. Pelosi's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing yet. AOC pressed on. Are we here to serve or just to survive? There it was. The air changed. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. A few of the younger reps subtly straightened in their chairs. A ripple, invisible but real, passed across the room. Pelosi's mouth curled just slightly, a half smile with no warmth. Survival, she said, isn't optional in politics, Congresswoman. It's the minimum required to do anything. She set the polling packet down, fanned it slightly with her fingers. And those lifelines you speak of, she added, they vanish if we lose the majority. You think this building is heartless now? Try watching it under Republican rule. The older representatives gave muted nods. They'd lived that era. They remembered the shutdowns, the committee purges, the bills burned in committee folders before reaching daylight. Pelosi was appealing to scar tissue, but AOC didn't retreat. She leaned forward slightly. If we teach voters that promises only count when they poll well, she said, what are we asking them to vote for next time? Strategy or substance? Pelosi didn't answer right away. She walked slowly toward the whiteboard at the far end of the room, uncapped a marker, and drew a crude graph. 2 axes, 2 arrows. This, she said, tapping the rising line, is public anger. This, she tapped the x-axis, is time. No one stopped her. If we feed that anger at the wrong time, we don't channel it, we detonate it. She set the marker down, and we get no second chances. Then she turned, faced the room again, and fixed her gaze back on AOC. This isn't idealism class, she said. It's legislative triage. The vote dies quietly or we die loudly. AOC stared at her, her lips pressed tight. She thought of the nurse named Carla, who'd come to her office 2 weeks ago in tears, telling her that her undocumented husband worked night shifts through COVID and still couldn't access basic coverage. She thought of the 3 kids who sat quietly in the waiting area, coloring with campaign pencils, not knowing they were at the mercy of political arithmetic. In that moment, AOC understood something chilling. Pelosi wasn't bluffing. She was calculating, and her calculation didn't include outrage. It required obedience. But AOC gave no sign of retreat. She reached for her pen again, not to write, just to hold. The clock on the wall ticked to 12:03 a.m. Nobody knew that 5 minutes ago, the mic embedded beneath the table had captured every word since the first whisper, and nobody noticed the tiny red light, still glowing, still listening. Nancy Pelosi stayed behind. She stood near the far corner of the room, speaking quietly to her senior aide, Mara Levin, a woman known for her discretion and titanium loyalty. They didn't realize the aide closest to the table hadn't powered down the mic embedded just beneath Pelosi's seat. The blinking red indicator, now steady, was easily mistaken for off, but it wasn't. Pelosi exhaled, a deep breath, a tired one. Then in a voice just above a whisper but clear enough to carry in a quiet room, she said, "She'll burn out like the rest. We'll make sure of it." 7 words, 13 syllables, the kind that didn't land like speech, but like shrapnel. AOC didn't react right away. At first, she wasn't even sure she heard it correctly. But Mara's eyes widening, just slightly, confirmed it wasn't imagined. The aide nodded once, but quickly, a gesture that meant, "I heard you, not I agree." Pelosi, unbothered, took a final look at the whiteboard, then started toward the door. AOC turned her head. She hadn't moved in nearly 3 minutes. Now she stood, slowly, deliberately, as if lifting herself into something heavier than the moment itself. A young staffer, barely 24, a fellow Latina intern standing near the water cooler, locked eyes with her. The intern had clearly heard it too. Her expression wasn't shock. It was heartbreak. Like seeing something she'd hoped wasn't true finally become undeniable. The rest of the room was already emptying, but the silence that followed that whisper lingered longer than footsteps. AOC said nothing. She didn't storm out, didn't slam a folder shut. She simply walked to the edge of the table, paused and looked down. There, half tucked beneath Pelosi's chair, was the small conference mic, still blinking, still red, still alive. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. A nearby intern setting down an iPad froze. He glanced at the mic, then back at AOC, then toward the door. There was no conversation, just the electric understanding of everyone in that room who had heard something they weren't meant to, and who now had to decide what to do with it. Outside, thunder rolled low across D.C., soft but ominous, like the drum beat before an entrance. Rain streaked the tall windows above ground. In the hallway, the overhead lights flickered briefly, not from power, but from indecision. Inside, AOC reached into her coat, pulled out her phone, and tapped it once. Not to record, not to post, just to see the time. 12:07 a.m. The Capitol, in all its weight and memory, was mostly sleeping, but history, it seemed, had insomnia. As she left the room, she glanced one last time at the chair Pelosi had occupied. The whiteboard still bore the crude graph, the one with the line labeled "Public Anger." But now beneath it, someone had written, in small block letters, perhaps a joke, or perhaps a prophecy. Sound carries. Outside the conference room, the marble hallway was still. Her heels echoed lightly as she walked alone toward the elevator, steps composed but firm. The intern watched her disappear around the corner. Then slowly, he reached for the control console, hesitated, and didn't press stop. By 4:12 a.m., the tweet had 8,000 retweets. By 5:06 a.m., hashtag Mick was never off was the #1 trending hashtag in Washington. By 5:57 a.m., it had crossed into national territory, bigger than the weather, bigger than sports, bigger than the Dow. The clip was short, 17 seconds, but it was devastating in its clarity. Pelosi's voice, unmistakable, weary yet sharp, leaned into the mic and said, "She'll burn out like the rest. We'll make sure of it." It was the kind of sentence that didn't require context to sting. The tone was enough. The timing was perfect. The implications were volcanic. Somewhere, while America slept, power had whispered its plan, and the nation had listened in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stirred in her apartment just after 6, the soft buzz of her phone nudging her out of sleep before the sun had risen. She reached instinctively toward the nightstand, eyes still half closed. Notifications stacked like bricks. 12 missed calls, 187 unread messages, 4 "Are you okay?" texts from staff, one from her mother in the Bronx. "Mija, what happened? You're on the news." She sat up, heart pounding before her brain had even caught up. Her phone trembled in her palm, her feed a blur of mentions, quotes, stitched video edits, and 1,000 versions of the same 17 seconds, looping like a national heartbeat. By 6:31 a.m., every major news outlet had picked it up. On MSNBC, Mika Brzezinski stared straight into the camera and said, "If this clip is real, and so far no one's denied it, then what we're hearing isn't just a political misstep. It's a strategy to destroy dissent from within the same party. That should scare all of us." Over on Fox News, they played it on a loop, gleefully. "Even they eat their own," one anchor quipped. On CNN, 2 analysts argued about whether Pelosi's words were taken out of context, but both agreed the damage was already done. The public didn't need context. They had tone, and tone told the story. AOC stood in her kitchen, the sun now bleeding, faint light through the blinds. Her hand curled around a mug she hadn't touched. Her TV was muted, but the closed captions ran across the bottom. "Pelosi in hot mic controversy, we'll make sure of it." She didn't need to watch it again. She'd been there. She'd heard it not just with her ears, but with her gut. Her staff group chat was on fire. Some were panicking. Others wanted her to issue a statement. One suggested they wait. Another said, lean in. Someone else texted, you just became the story. Own it before they rewrite it. Outside, DC was still half asleep. But inside the Beltway, the machine had kicked into gear. Calls were being made. Damage was being assessed. A dozen consultants were already typing memos titled things like hot mic containment strategy and narrative flip option. But the truth was, no one knew how to flip this. It was too raw, too revealing, and too real. AOC finally spoke, quietly to no one in particular, just to the empty space of her apartment. They didn't even wait until I was gone. Then she looked up, at the small frame photo on her bookshelf, one her father had taken of her when she was 14, standing on the steps of the Capitol during a school field trip. In it, she was pointing upward with a shy smile, notebook in hand, not knowing she'd one day walk those halls with a badge, a voice, and a mic that never really turned off. She picked up her phone, typed nothing, posted nothing, just stared for a long time. Because sometimes the moment you go viral is the moment you realize they're not just watching, they're waiting. And today, the whole country was waiting. Pelosi's office released a brief statement at 9:03 a.m. The audio circulating online appears heavily edited and lacks contextual integrity. The speaker has always supported unity and transparency within the party. We urge responsible media platforms not to amplify misleading fragments. It was only 42 words long, but it was carefully worded, just enough deniability to cast doubt, just enough vagueness to avoid a direct lie. The phrase lacks contextual integrity began appearing on pundit panels like a new catchphrase. Within the hour, 3 political influencers and 2 columnists had already used it, some reading it directly from their notes, as if distributed in advance. By noon, the spin was in full motion. Senior aides whispered to reporters that the clip could have been taken from a training exercise or a mock scenario discussion. One DC insider suggested it may have been an impersonation. Fox News called it dem-on-dem violence. MSNBC called it a crisis of trust. CNN hosted a 4-person panel where no one said anything definitive. But America wasn't waiting for permission. The clip had now crossed 19 million views across platforms. TikTok edits layered Pelosi's line over marching drums. Instagram Reels showed split-screen images. Pelosi at a podium, AOC standing silent in the House. Reddit threads parsed every breath, every pause, comparing it to past footage of her voice to confirm authenticity. The people weren't analyzing spin, they were dissecting tone, and tone, more than facts, told the truth. In AOC's office, the blinds were still drawn. Her team sat around the long wooden table in silence, everyone with laptops open, fingers poised over keyboards, but no one typing. The room buzzed not with noise, but pressure. Her communications director finally broke the silence. If we respond, it gives their denial a second win. If we don't, we lose narrative control. Her chief of staff disagreed. We don't need to control the narrative. We already are the narrative. The country heard what they heard. But AOC wasn't looking at them. She was scrolling through her inbox, reading emails faster than she could process them. Some were terrifying. You're a disgrace. They should have shut your mic off years ago. Lying witch. Go back to bartending. America doesn't need mouthy girls in lipstick playing hero. Others weren't. One subject line simply read, "Thank you." She opened it. A short message from a retired nurse in Arizona. I watched that clip. I cried. You're the only one who doesn't talk in code. You're the only one still honest. AOC exhaled. The truth was, she hadn't planned any of this. She hadn't recorded the mic. She hadn't leaked the clip. And yet, in a way she didn't ask for and couldn't control, she had become the voice for something older than either of them. Older than Pelosi, older than strategy. She had become the mirror. And what power saw in that mirror terrified it. Her phone buzzed again. Another notification. This one from a Hill reporter. Any comment, Congresswoman? She didn't reply. Not yet. Pelosi hadn't called. Not even a text. No contact. The silence, AOC realized, wasn't absence. It was intentional, strategic, the kind of silence that let others do the talking. For you, around you, above you. AOC stood slowly, walked over to the window. She pulled the blinds back slightly and looked out over D.C. From her office, she could see the back steps of the Capitol, where press vans now lined the curb like vultures circling something still breathing. She whispered to herself, not in defiance but in reflection. She doesn't need to shout. She has a system that shouts for her. Behind her, one of her staffers watched the live feed from a daytime political roundtable. A former speechwriter for a past administration was speaking. "What's dangerous here isn't the comment," he said, leaning forward, voice calm. "It's that people believe she said it. They believe it because it sounds like the truth. And that belief is now bigger than the speaker." No one in AOC's office moved, because belief, once unchained, doesn't wait for a statement. It becomes one. Not a soft drizzle, not something poetic, just a relentless downpour that turns sidewalks into mirrors and soaked coats in seconds. Staffers urged her to cancel. Her scheduler sent 3 backup plans. One aide said it outright. "We should reschedule. Visibility's too high, optics too risky." But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was already halfway to the Bronx. The town hall had been on the calendar for weeks, planned long before the clip exploded, long before her name dominated the headlines. It was supposed to be a routine check-in with local residents, updates on housing, public transit, and the new Green Space Initiative. Nothing viral, nothing cinematic, just service. And yet, when the black sedan pulled up to the community center on East 138th, the crowd spilled out far beyond the canopies. Umbrellas bloomed like wildflowers, rain-soaked sneakers and church shoes alike. Children stood on milk crates under ponchos. Elderly residents clutched folding chairs with one hand and each other with the other. No press platforms, no podium. Just people. Waiting. AOC stepped out into the storm without an umbrella. The crowd erupted, not with roars but with energy. Raw, rising, defiant. She didn't walk to the front. She walked into them. The staff scrambled to keep up, shielding her with clipboards, but she waved them off. She made her way to the center of the crowd where a school cafeteria table had been covered with a blue tarp. A local teacher handed her a microphone, worn, wrapped in plastic, wired to an old amp buzzing faintly. She didn't have notes. She didn't have a plan. She had rain in her eyes and truth in her mouth. And she began. "I wasn't planning to speak about what's happening in Washington." The crowd quieted instantly. Even the rain, it seemed, held its breath. "But I also wasn't planning on becoming a headline. I didn't ask for a microphone. I didn't know it was still on, but maybe it had to be." The wind picked up, whipping her hair against her face, but she didn't flinch. She looked out at the soaked faces before her, young and old, angry and hopeful. Some came with signs, others came with questions, but they all came with ears, and that mattered more than any microphone. "When powerful people speak behind closed doors," she said, "they often believe no one is listening. But this country, this community, we've been listening for a long time, and now for once, they were heard." A man in the back shouted, "We got your back, AOC." Cheers followed. Someone held up a cardboard sign painted in dripping red marker. The mic was never off. Another voice rose from somewhere near the center. "Don't dim the flame." It wasn't planned. It wasn't even that loud, but it caught, a ripple of repetition, then a wave. "Don't dim the flame! Don't dim the flame! Don't dim the flame!" The chant spread like fire in a storm, and AOC didn't stop them. She stood in it, with it, letting their voices lift what her own couldn't carry alone. She waited, listened, smiled not in triumph, but in recognition. Then she said, almost as a whisper into the mic, "Let them say it was a mistake. Let them say it was edited. But ask yourselves, why did it sound so true?" No answer came. None was needed. The rain kept falling. The amps buzzed. And hundreds stayed long after the official program ended, soaked, freezing, alive. It wasn't a campaign rally. It wasn't a protest. It was a declaration, silent, soaked, and unforgettable. And the storm? It hadn't just come from the sky. It was rising from the street. Not an official meeting, not even a calendar invite. Just a string of blue bubbles between 7 younger members of Congress, progressives, mostly in their 30s and early 40s, who had been elected on promises they were now being told to delay or dismantle. The chat's name had originally been something playful, New Wave 2024, but after the hot mic clip broke, it was renamed quietly, without fanfare, to They Heard It Too. At 10:14 a.m. on a Wednesday, someone in the thread floated it. Do we file a motion of censure? Silence, then. She'll crush us. She already is. Wouldn't be the first time she used donors as weapons. It wasn't public yet, not officially, but rumors had begun to circulate. In 3 swing districts where younger candidates backed by progressive coalitions were beginning to gain traction, major PACs had suddenly pulled funding. Local campaign offices had gone dark overnight. Phone banks silenced. Volunteer trainings canceled without explanation. The pattern wasn't coincidence. It was choreography, and Pelosi's fingerprints were everywhere. Back in D.C., in private lunches and whispered hallway corners, stories spread like cracks across old marble. A House candidate in Michigan received a call from a senior party liaison suggesting she tone down the rhetoric if she wanted 800 support. A New York challenger to a long-standing incumbent found herself removed from a labor union's endorsement slate the day after retweeting AOC's speech. In California, an upstart organizer discovered her recurring donations from a national fundraising platform had been frozen for compliance concerns no one could explain. Officially, nothing had changed, but unofficially, a quiet war had begun. Inside the Rayburn building, 2 junior members of Congress, one from Texas, the other from Illinois, met in a cramped office with the blinds drawn and their phones on airplane mode. The Texas rep, a former teacher turned legislator, tapped his pen nervously against a folder. You know what this means, right? He said. We move. We burn bridges we haven't even walked across yet. His colleague nodded. Yeah, but if we don't move, we're not walking anywhere at all. We're just circling. The censure option wasn't unprecedented. It was symbolic, not binding. But it sent a message. And not just to Pelosi, to the donors, the strategists, the machine, that not everyone was afraid, but fear still worked. That was the problem. Back in AOC's office, the atmosphere had shifted. Not panicked, resolved. One staffer noted, they're playing this like a military campaign. Another said, good. So are we. AOC, meanwhile, kept silent about the censure discussions. She hadn't initiated them. She hadn't endorsed them. But she hadn't shut them down either, because something deeper than defiance was now at play. A generation watching in real time whether the values they were taught, integrity, accountability, truth, could survive contact with the machinery of American power. And Pelosi, she didn't flinch. That afternoon, she held a closed-door lunch with 6 senior members of the caucus. No press, no statements, just a few phrases that later leaked via unnamed sources. Containment, isolate the narrative, let her drown in her own echo. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was erosion. Smother the flames, control the donors, starve the momentum, make standing with AOC seem dangerous, or worse, irrelevant. But as night fell across Washington, another email leaked. This time, it wasn't a message from Pelosi or her staff. It was an internal strategy memo sent to major party fundraisers 2 days earlier. The subject line read, Progressive Surge, Contain, and Reframe. And just like that, the cracks were no longer private. They were structural. Nancy Pelosi sat across from the anchor, legs crossed, pearls steady. Her expression was composed, precise. This wasn't damage control, it was orchestration. She wasn't here to answer questions, she was here to redirect the storm. I think what we're seeing, she said with a faint smile, is a difference in approach. Some of our newer members are driven by emotion. And while that can be admirable, it's not always strategic. She didn't say AOC's name. She didn't have to. The host, sensing the moment, leaned in. To clarify, are you suggesting the Congresswoman is acting impulsively? Pelosi paused, a beat longer than necessary. I'm saying that when you govern with only emotion, she replied, you risk forgetting that real change is built on patience, process, and partnership. Passion is not policy. The line was instantly clipped, captioned, posted. Within minutes, hashtag passion is not policy trended alongside hashtag Mick was never off. Some users mocked it, others echoed it, but everyone was watching. Back in her DC apartment, AOC sat curled on the couch, her laptop open, phone glowing in her hand. She hadn't expected the interview, not tonight, but it didn't surprise her either. This was the old playbook: undermine without naming, reframe without engaging, and appear reasonable while drawing blood. Her team group chat exploded. Do we respond? She just called you immature without blinking. This'll dominate the morning cycle. You want the last word or the first? AOC didn't reply immediately. She stared at the pause frame on her screen. Pelosi mid-sentence, the picture of polished composure. She respected her. She hated that she still did, because it wasn't the insult that cut deep. It was the implication that truth only mattered when it fit a plan. That conscience was a luxury, not a compass. She opened Twitter, typed 6 words. If emotion means conscience, I'll own it. She hit send. The tweet hit like a spark in dry grass. Replies poured in, some furious, some inspired. Celebrities retweeted it. Former students, civil rights leaders, even a few quiet Republicans. Screenshots of the tweet appeared on news tickers within 20 minutes. One anchor on MSNBC read it aloud and said simply, "That's not strategy. That's soul." But AOC didn't tweet again that night. She didn't need to. Because within the hour, political podcasts began dissecting not just Pelosi's interview, but the difference in tone between the two women. She's not denying what she said, one host pointed out. She's just reframing the leak as immature. But let's be honest, we've all heard that tone before, from someone who thought no one was listening. On TikTok, young voters stitched the CNN clip to AOC's tweet, turning it into a 30-second mic drop moment, set to orchestral music. On Instagram, educators posted it with captions like, "We tell our students, speak up. Now we're watching what happens when someone does." Even in the more conservative corners of the media world, something had shifted. A libertarian-leaning commentator remarked, "I don't agree with AOC on policy, but I respect someone who says what they mean, even if it burns them." Back in Pelosi's office, the mood was colder. Aide after aide reviewed headlines, trying to spin, trying to mute. But the tweet had cut through. Not because it was loud, but because it was simple. And simple truth, when spoken plainly, is almost impossible to kill. That night, AOC walked alone through the Capitol Rotunda, the marble echoing under her steps. She paused beneath the dome, looked up, and thought of every woman who had stood in this place before her. Some erased, some vilified, most forgotten. She whispered under her breath, not out of bitterness, but something closer to resolve. If this is war, at least I didn't start it with silence. No caption, no commentary. Just a single PDF attachment posted by a congressional aide on a small but credible policy blog. The headline read plainly, 2019 Leadership Memo, HR 482, Wage Adjustment Strategy. The file wasn't marked classified. It didn't need to be. Its content was damning all the same. Page 2 contained a note from then-Speaker Pelosi's policy director, advising against advancing a $15 minimum wage bill in 2019 due to market confidence concerns and timing optics for upcoming donor engagements. It concluded with a now infamous line, "Delay indefinitely. Prioritize perception over passage." By 6:45 a.m., Politico had picked it up. By 7:03, Morning Joe was reading it on air. By 8 o'clock, it had been shared by 2.4 million people. The memo wasn't scandalous by DC standards. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even surprising. But it was honest, in the coldest way possible. And for a public still simmering from the hot mic debacle, it read like a confirmation that the mask hadn't just slipped. It had never been on. Pelosi's team scrambled. A spokesperson called it a dated contextual document not reflective of present values. Another aide dismissed it as a snapshot of strategy in flux. But the headlines wrote themselves: delay over dignity, minimum wage, maximum spin, power plays in plain text. Bipartisan discomfort followed. Progressives were furious, of course, but so were centrists, who now faced town hall crowds asking how long this had been going on. Even moderate Republicans found an angle. One tweeted sarcastically, "Glad to know we're not the only party that sells silence." Cable news ran side-by-side images. Pelosi at a 2019 press conference promising to fight for working families, and the leaked memo advising leadership to deprioritize labor-facing initiatives during Q3 fundraising. In the echo chamber of the Capitol, no one spoke it aloud, but everyone knew AOC had leaked it. She didn't tweet it, didn't post it, but the timing, the trail, the subtle push through a back-channel staffer, it bore her fingerprints. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated reveal, and it worked. In her office, AOC sat in silence, watching the chaos unfold from her phone, the news anchors growing breathless with every passing segment. A staffer asked if she wanted to prepare a statement. Another wondered if they should push response content, but she waved them off. "This one speaks for itself," she said. She left the building before noon, alone. No entourage, no cameras. She walked 2 blocks to a small park bench tucked between rows of elms, barely noticed. She sat, pulled out her phone again, not for Twitter or press, but for a file in her voicemail marked "Saved Dad." It was old, grainy, from before she even ran for office. His voice came through faint but full of life. "Hey, mija, I know the world's heavy, but you've got more fire than fear. Just remember, fear fades, fire doesn't." She didn't cry, not this time. She whispered aloud, "I'm not scared, just tired." Not tired like exhaustion, tired like clarity, like someone who's seen behind too many curtains and realized the wizards aren't wizards at all. Just people with polished words and permanent excuses. The wind picked up gently, rustling the leaves. Back in the Capitol, the whisper network shifted into overdrive. Emails flew. Staffers panicked. Senior Democrats scheduled closed-door huddles. Pelosi remained silent, her office issuing only a boilerplate denial and one curt phrase to the press. "We don't litigate leadership in the media," but the media was already litigating it, and this time the courtroom was national. The document, 3 pages, signed by 2 senior representatives and endorsed quietly by 3 more, accused Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of a breach of internal decorum, citing willful dissemination of internal materials and behavior unbecoming of a member entrusted with party cohesion. The timing was strategic, early enough to make the morning news cycle, late enough to ensure AOC's office had no chance to respond before the headlines wrote themselves. By 8:15, Capitol reporters were already using a new phrase fed to them by anonymous sources: ethics turbulence. By 9:30, camera crews were setting up outside room 314 of the Cannon House office building. They knew the drill. This wasn't the first time political theatrics were masked as procedure. But something was different this time. The air, the stakes, the feeling that this wasn't about punishment, it was about silencing. Inside the chamber, the hearing wasn't labeled public, but it wasn't private either. That ambiguity was intentional. Enough transparency to claim fairness, enough vagueness to control the narrative. The room was clinical: white walls, gray carpet, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. AOC entered without fanfare. No entourage, just one staffer, a legal advisor, and a manila folder. She wore slate gray, neither defiant nor submissive. Across from her sat 3 members of the Ethics Review Subcommittee. 2 were Pelosi loyalists. 1 was independent, an older Vietnam veteran from Oregon who'd built a reputation on quiet integrity and a disdain for grandstanding. He didn't smile when AOC entered. He just nodded once. The chair of the panel, Representative Wendell Sharp, cleared his throat and began. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, we're here today to assess potential violations of House decorum standards, stemming from recent events that have brought undue disruption to the stability of this institution." AOC said nothing. "Specifically," Sharp continued, "your alleged connection to the release of internal party strategy documents and," he glanced down, lips tightening, "unauthorized commentary regarding senior leadership." That phrase, unauthorized commentary, hung in the room like smoke. They weren't accusing her of leaking the memo. They weren't accusing her of lying. They were accusing her of breaking the one rule that mattered most in Washington. You don't embarrass the machine. AOC leaned forward. May I speak? Sharp hesitated, then nodded. If by decorum you mean silence, she said calmly, then I accept the charge. If by disruption you mean telling the public the truth, then I'm guilty. No one moved. Let me ask this. What is the appropriate way to reveal that party leadership stalled wage reform to protect donors? Should I have sent it in a holiday card? One of the panelists shifted uncomfortably. Another scribbled something without looking up. AOC didn't blink. You're not protecting ethics. You're punishing transparency. At that moment, the door to the hearing room opened slightly, and a staffer leaned in to whisper something to one of the members. They passed over a folded piece of paper. Eyes scanned. Faces froze. Outside, a low murmur rippled through the media line. The memo had just been authenticated by a senior 800 official. A whistleblower had come forward. The leak was no longer speculation. It was fact. And now the hearing was no longer about optics. It was about fallout. Inside, Sharp cleared his throat again, but softer this time. He turned to the independent panel member, the veteran, who raised his hand gently. I'd like to move that we pause these proceedings, he said, voice gravelly but clear. We may be assessing the wrong party. A hush, a decision not made but implied. AOC didn't smile. She simply gathered her folder, stood, and waited for the official word. Sharp nodded stiffly. The session is adjourned pending further review. And just like that, she walked out, past the cameras, past the waiting press, past the system that thought it could quietly consume her. And outside, for the first time in a week, the sun broke through the clouds. But inside the Capitol, a storm was only just beginning. Colonel Thomas Rourke, representative from Oregon's 6th District, 74 years old, combat veteran, twice wounded, once captured, now in his 5th term, hadn't spoken a word since the hearing began. He'd listened, observed, made no sudden gestures, just the occasional scribble in a notebook that looked like it had survived a war zone of its own. And now, as the murmurs grew around the leaked memo's authentication and the weight of the moment pressed down like a thundercloud trapped indoors, it was Rourke who finally raised his voice, not with volume, but with gravity. I'd like to speak on the record, he said. The room paused. Even the reporters shifting behind the glass window seemed to still. Rourke cleared his throat and pushed his chair back an inch, the leather groaning beneath his shoulders. He didn't look at AOC. He looked at his fellow committee members, then at the air, as if speaking not just to the room, but to something larger. I've sat in a lot of rooms like this, he began, where people in power tried to shame the ones who spoke when they weren't supposed to. I've seen men ordered to stay quiet while wrong decisions cost lives. I've seen silence used not as strategy, but as a weapon. A beat. He turned gently toward AOC. And whatever you think of the Congresswoman's methods, let me say this plainly. She didn't use silence. She refused to become it. The room shifted again, this time not with tension, but with recalibration, like a ship slowly turning mid-current. One of the Republican members on the panel, a representative from Ohio known more for finance than fairness, leaned back in his chair and nodded slightly, folding his arms. His colleague next to him, a younger conservative who had previously mocked progressives on social media, didn't nod, but didn't object either. Rourke continued. This isn't about whether she leaked a memo. It's about whether that memo told a truth worth hiding, and we're pretending to be offended by how it came out, because we're not brave enough to admit we were already ashamed of what it said. Sharp shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable now. This wasn't part of the script. Rourke wasn't done. When I was in uniform, we used to say, silence protects the powerful, speech protects the living. I didn't come back from war to watch this institution teach young leaders that loyalty means complicity. He leaned back slowly and looked across the dais. I move that we delay the vote on this matter until a full inquiry into the contents of the memo is completed. Let's investigate the substance before we punish the whistle. No one spoke for several seconds. It wasn't just unexpected. It was Uninvited clarity, the kind that didn't play by the party's invisible rules. Sharp cleared his throat. That's, well, that's within procedure, yes. A motion to delay, subject to majority consensus? All in favor? Hands rose, slowly but enough. Even one of Pelosi's loyalists, now clearly rattled, half lifted his hand as if to avoid making the front page either way. AOC sat motionless. She hadn't expected this. Not from him. Outside the room, reporters whispered furiously into phones. The delay meant no formal reprimand, no public declaration of guilt, and the memo, once a political liability, had now become a legal document under scrutiny. Its contents no longer contested, but central. When the session adjourned, Rourke didn't linger. He stood, gathered his old leather notebook, and nodded once. This time, directly at her. You held your ground, he said. Don't let them tell you that's weakness. AOC offered a faint, genuine smile. Thank you, sir. Rourke grunted, almost a laugh. You're not fighting them, he added, already walking away. You're just reminding them someone still is. And with that, he was gone. But the message lingered. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at the hearing table, her fingers lightly pressed against the edge of her manila folder. She hadn't spoken since Rourke finished. She didn't need to. The room had spoken for itself. But now her purpose there was done. The political theater had played out. The pageantry of condemnation had collapsed under its own weight. What remained was only performance, and she had no interest in performing. Without fanfare, she stood. No announcement, no dramatic gesture. Just the sound of her chair pushing back slowly across the carpet. The room's eyes followed her, some curious, some cautious, some calculating. She turned to the panel, nodded once, politely but firmly, then turned away. At the door, a congressional staff photographer instinctively raised their camera, capturing the side angle of her profile. Jaw set, eyes forward, steps measured. A single flash lit the moment. That photo would, within hours, become the defining image of the week. But in that moment, something even more unexpected happened. A second chair scraped softly behind her. Representative Layla Dawson, first-term Democrat from Minnesota, 36, a former public defender who'd largely kept her head down since entering Congress, stood without saying a word. She adjusted her blazer, collected her notes, and walked toward the exit behind AOC. The room tensed. Then another. Congressman Daniel Reese, mid-40s, Arizona swing district, known for his cautious centrism, rose next. He didn't speak either, just a nod, slow and deliberate, and a steady walk toward the back. By the time AOC reached the door, 5 more had joined, not shouting, not protesting, just walking, together in silence. It was more than defiance, it was dignity, coordinated not by planning, but by principle. Reporters, pressed against the hallway glass, scrambled to adjust lenses. One journalist whispered, "Are they walking out?" Another replied, "They're making a statement without saying a damn word." Outside, flash after flash captured the chain of quiet rebellion. AOC didn't stop. She didn't look at the cameras. She simply moved forward, flanked now not by staff, but by conscience in motion. In the rotunda, a tourist group paused to watch the procession. One teenager recognized her, whispered, "That's her. That's the one from the clip." A teacher nearby murmured, "This is history." And it was. By the time they reached the Capitol steps, the walkout had become more than symbolic. It had become visual. 30 seconds of B-roll footage that would be clipped, shared, looped with solemn piano music, and quoted text overlays. By noon, the image of AOC at the front of the group, shoulders squared, head held high, was on every major network. The New York Times ran it above the fold. The caption read simply, "They walked out," and the country watched. A columnist later wrote, "She left before the gavel dropped." But the verdict had already been delivered. In posture, in poise, in the echo of 7 chairs no longer filled. Back inside the chamber, the ethics subcommittee recessed into procedural disarray. No vote, no ruling, just the stark emptiness of a space that had been stripped of its target and now stood hollow in her absence. Sharp fumbled with his notes. Another panelist coughed into his sleeve. Only Rourke remained unmoved, scribbling one final note in his leather-bound pad before closing it with a quiet snap. The silence, ironically, had now become the loudest part of the entire hearing. And outside, on the Capitol steps, Alexandria paused, just briefly, before descending into the crowd below. One camera caught her from the side again. This time her lips moved. No mic caught the words, but those who watched closely later swore they could read them. It's not over. And they were right. It had only just begun. First, it was a campaign in Pennsylvania's 17th. Maya Tran, a former union organizer turned grassroots candidate. 2 weeks earlier, her fundraising was steady. She just landed a local endorsement and had AOC speak at her rally via livestream. Spirits were high. Then suddenly, overnight, her recurring donations from 2 major national platforms were paused for review. Then came the phone calls. A consulting firm she'd hired, a DC boutique operation with ties to Democratic campaign infrastructure, quietly backed out of her media strategy. When asked why, they simply said, "We're shifting focus this quarter." Her media buy vanished in 48 hours. Then came the second hit. Andre Martinez, a city councilman in Nevada running for a House seat with AOC's public support, reported a donor freeze from a union PAC he'd worked with for years. The head of the PAC apologized, but admitted off the record, "We got a call. They said this cycle's priorities are elsewhere." Within days, both campaigns lost nearly 40% of their fundraising pipelines. No memos, no press releases, just silence and retreat. But silence, like always, has fingerprints. Behind closed doors, campaign directors whispered what no one dared print. It was the speaker's circle. Pelosi wasn't making speeches. She didn't have to. She was speaking in currency, and every operative knew how to read it. One anonymous consultant described it bluntly to a reporter who wouldn't go on the record. "It's not that she made the call, it's that everyone believed she could." That was the real power. Plausible deniability wrapped in a velvet glove. In AOC's office, the updates rolled in slowly. First, emails from staffers in both campaigns, then calls, then screenshots of texts between field organizers scrambling to explain to volunteers why the money was drying up. AOC read them one by one. One message from Maya stood out. "They can block money, but they can't block momentum unless we let them." Still, the chill was real and strategic, not meant to break her, but to isolate her. Send a message to anyone standing too close. This wasn't a scorched earth campaign. This was a frost that spread slowly, unnoticed, until you realized nothing around you could grow. By week's end, 4 more progressive challengers, all loosely connected to AOC's orbit, reported sudden delays in vendor payments, canceled event space bookings, or mysterious miscommunications with fundraising platforms. It was all off the books, all unofficial, all perfectly deniable, but unmistakably coordinated. In a back hallway of the Capitol, a senior Democrat, someone who once posed smiling in a photo with AOC during her first year, brushed past her without a word. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, just distance, clean and practiced. Her chief of staff summed it up best, later that day in a closed meeting. "They're not shouting, they're starving." Outside, headlines still swirled from the walkout, but inside, the real fight had shifted to back channels, to finance departments, to inboxes with invisible subject lines. And for the first time since the clip had gone viral, AOC felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not rage, but isolation. They weren't coming for her directly. They were coming for her shadow. The Capitol had long since gone quiet. Outside, DC sat under a cold, windless sky, and the glow from the city's street lamps bled softly against the windows of AOC's office. Most of her team had gone home. A single lamp was still on, a single document open on her screen, and her thoughts, loud, endless, circling. The phone rang only once. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, weathered, and unmistakable. "Alexandria," the man said, "this is Senator Alden Ross." I figured it was time I called. She hadn't spoken to Ross in nearly 2 years. The retired senator from Colorado was known in his time as the conscience of the chamber, blunt, principled, often sidelined for refusing to play the game the way others did. When he'd retired, he gave a farewell speech that ended not with applause but with silence, the kind of silence that came with truth too sharp to cheer. AOC sat up straighter in her chair. "I watched the hearing," he said. "Watched the walkout, the photo, the fire." She didn't say anything at first. "I've been where you are," Ross continued, "just not with your reach, and not with your youth, which makes you dangerous to them in a way I never was." AOC exhaled. "They're not just pushing back," she said. "They're erasing people I care about, quietly, systematically." Ross was quiet for a moment. Then, "They've had 50 years to build a maze where people like you get lost or worn out. And if you keep trying to win inside that maze, they'll always stay one corner ahead." AOC rubbed her temple. "So what? Just quit?" "No," he said. "Change the damn maze. Or better, step out of it." She paused. "You're fighting her in her arena," Ross said, voice low but pointed. "Arenas built on party rules, donor lists, and committee loyalties. But you don't need that floor to speak. You've got a stage already. Millions of people standing in front of it. Stop answering to the building. Answer to the crowd." AOC turned to her laptop. The blank document open on the screen, originally meant for internal response talking points, suddenly felt irrelevant, like writing inside a box no longer big enough for the moment. "What would you do?" she asked. Ross didn't hesitate. "I'd write a letter," he said. "Not to the speaker, not to your colleagues, but to the people watching, the ones who've never been in that building, but still pay the price for what's said in it." AOC nodded slowly. "A letter," she repeated. "Plain, honest, unapologetic," Ross said. "Because when history reads back moments like this, it won't quote subcommittee transcripts. It'll quote the ones who broke script." She smiled. It was small but real. "Thanks, Senator." "Don't thank me," Ross replied. "Just remind them why they feared your mic in the first place." When the call ended, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt full, like breath before the first word of a new sentence. AOC placed her fingers on the keyboard. She didn't title the document. She simply began to write, folded neatly inside the Sunday editions of the New York Times and the Washington Post. Printed full page with no photo, no color, no banner, just black text on white space. At the top, "To the people I work for," no logo, no official seal, no congressional watermark, just a name, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And under that, a letter that read like something between confession and confrontation. Not defensive, not righteous, just honest. It began simply, "I never intended to become the center of this story, but maybe the truth needs a face before it can be heard." And then, line by line, she walked the reader through the past few weeks, not with outrage but with clarity, the mic that stayed on, the whispers that turned into headlines, the hearings that danced around ethics but never touched accountability, the slow, invisible freezing of allies in districts too afraid to stay warm beside her. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. This isn't about a moment. This is about a pattern, a system that rewards silence, punishes clarity, and only allows truth to enter the room after it's been edited. Then came the sentence that would be quoted on every major news outlet within hours. The mic was never off, and neither should be our vigilance. It was a line that didn't shout. It whispered, and somehow that made it louder. It didn't ask for applause. It asked for attention, for thought, for remembering. She ended the letter not with a rallying cry, but a reflection. "You don't have to agree with everything I say. You don't have to stand where I stand. But if the next generation looks back at this moment, wondering who chose to keep the lights on, let them find your name too." It was signed by hand, not scanned, not digital. Real ink, the kind that smudged slightly in the corner, where the pressure changed mid-signature. By noon, the letter was trending on every platform. A panelist on MSNBC called it the most honest paragraph in Congress this year. A conservative talk show host grudgingly said, "I don't like her politics, but I'll be damned if that didn't hit me in the gut." One newspaper ran a poll. Did AOC just outmaneuver the party establishment without saying a single word on camera? The majority said yes. In classrooms, teachers printed the letter for civics lessons. In coffee shops, people read it aloud. On Twitter, users shared their favorite lines as though quoting scripture. Inside the Capitol, it was met with silence, again. No formal responses, no press conferences, but the shift was palpable. Staffers whispered in elevators. Members paused longer than usual when passing her in hallways. Some nodded, some didn't, but they were listening now. Later that evening, AOC sat in her apartment, the letter folded on her kitchen table, next to a ceramic mug and a half-drunk glass of water. Her phone buzzed endlessly, but she ignored it. Instead, she opened her window, breathed in the early fall air, and stared out at the city she had sworn to represent. Not just with votes, but with voice. For the first time in weeks, there were no flashbulbs, no microphones, no questions. Just her. And a silence she had finally reclaimed. Not as a weapon, but as peace. And far away in 1,000 homes across America, her letter lay open. Read, marked, remembered. A symbolic vote. A party show of unity. Language crafted so carefully it said almost nothing, yet meant everything to those who understood the signals. The measure, titled House Resolution 843, Commitment to Shared Democratic Values, had been drafted not for policy, but for optics. Pelosi's team had called it a necessary gesture. It had been added to the schedule quietly, nestled between bills on infrastructure and cybersecurity, but everyone in the chamber knew what it was really about: control. After the hearings, the walkout, and the letter, the party needed to show that the ship was steady, that nothing had fractured, that the narrative was still theirs to dictate. At 10:03 a.m., the chamber filled gradually. Members exchanged quiet nods, hushed commentary, cautious eye contact. Pelosi arrived early and took her seat with practiced poise. Her aides moved like shadows around her, efficient, unspeaking. She glanced once at the vote board, then at her whip list. Everything was in place, except one name: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She wasn't expected, not officially. Her vote wasn't needed numerically. Her absence would raise eyebrows, but not alarms. Pelosi had calculated that the Congresswoman would sit this one out, that she'd remain on the sidelines, allow the chamber to exhale without her presence lingering like a challenge in the air. At 10:21 a.m., the speaker tapped the gavel and called the floor to order. Members straightened. The clerk began the roll. And then, the doors at the rear of the chamber opened. The sound was soft but sharp in the silence. Every head turned. AOC entered without escort. No papers, no phone, just her and the echo of her heels against the floor. She wore deep navy, unbranded, unadorned, her hair pulled back, expression unreadable. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She didn't glance at Pelosi. She walked the length of the chamber slowly, as if time had adjusted itself around her. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Aides froze in their tracks. One C-SPAN cameraman instinctively zoomed in, the image sharp and impossibly still. She took her seat in the second row, center left, folded her hands, waited. The speaker didn't flinch, but her fingers curled once against the armrest. The motion was read aloud by the clerk. A paragraph of platitudes, unity, shared values, respect for institutional process. The language so smooth it could have been written by a committee of mirrors. But the tension in the room was no longer about the resolution. It was about her presence. She hadn't come to make a speech. She hadn't come to disrupt. She hadn't even come to lead. She had come to sit, boldly, silently, visibly. And in that silence, she took the air back. Some members glanced at her. Others pointedly looked away. A few younger representatives straightened their spines as if her posture gave them permission to breathe differently. The vote began. As names were called, green lights blinked steadily. Yes, yes, yes. Then, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez? A pause. She pressed her button. Present. Not yes, not number, just present. A ripple passed through the room. Not audible, but palpable. Not opposition, not surrender. just a refusal to be categorized. She didn't look around. She didn't need to, because in that moment, her silence spoke the loudest. No one had requested her to speak. No announcement had been made. But the chamber seemed to pause around her presence, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The podium stood empty. She moved toward it without hesitation, yet without urgency, like someone who knew the words she carried didn't need to be delivered loudly to be heard deeply. C-SPAN cut to a wide shot. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward. A few representatives shifted in their seats, some out of discomfort, others out of anticipation. The rest, out of respect they didn't yet want to admit. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reached the podium and adjusted the microphone with one hand. The lights above washed over her face, calm, composed, a trace of weariness in her eyes, but no trace of defeat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't name names. She didn't point fingers, but she pointed truth. This isn't a war of personalities, she began, her voice low, firm. It's a battle for promises. A subtle murmur rippled across the room, quickly silenced by the tension in her tone. We stand in this chamber every week, she continued, passing bills, making statements, issuing declarations of unity, some sincere, some symbolic. And yet, outside these walls, the people we serve are watching, wondering if what we say here is for them or just for each other. Her voice trembled slightly on that line, not with fear, but with weight. I've been accused of emotion, of being too visible, too vocal, too much. But the truth is, what we're too often afraid to say in here is what people are desperate to hear out there. That sometimes this place chooses safety over sincerity, and sometimes that silence costs more than speaking ever could. Several heads lowered. A few turned away. Others stayed locked on her. She went on without pause. This chamber taught me many things. Procedure, patience, how to wait my turn. But it never taught me how to look a constituent in the eye and explain why we chose delay over dignity. A pause, not for drama, but for breath. She looked toward the gallery, not at anyone in particular, but through the moment itself. I'm not here today to rebuke anyone. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to ask a question we've forgotten how to ask, one that doesn't belong to any party or platform. Are we still doing the work we promised? Or are we just performing the part we've learned to survive in? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of reckoning, of unspoken agreements breaking quietly inside old minds. She placed her hand on the podium lightly. This institution doesn't need louder voices. It needs clearer ones. It doesn't need new slogans. It needs remembered commitments. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't wait for it either. She simply said, "Thank you," and stepped away. Her voice never broke, but something in the room did. Across the room, Nancy Pelosi sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded as they always were, atop a thin stack of neatly typed notes she no longer looked at. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes didn't move. For years, she had been the one to speak last, always. The closer, the coda, the quiet sword behind the velvet curtain. But today she said nothing. Not because she didn't have the words, because she understood for the first time in a very long time that no words would suffice. A junior member leaned toward her slightly, whispering, "Madam Speaker, would you like to?" But she raised a hand without turning. She gathered her folder, stood slowly, deliberately, not hurried, not rattled, but measured. The movement was small, but the chamber felt it. Dozens of eyes followed, some confused, some stunned, a few quietly awed. She turned without looking in AOC's direction and began walking up the aisle. And for the first time in her long, towering career, Nancy Pelosi left a floor session while the room still held its breath. She exited without a word, and the weight of that silence said more than any rebuttal could. The chamber remained still. A few members looked toward AOC as if expecting her to rise again, to finish what had begun. But she didn't. She remained seated, calm, composed. She knew better than to chase the moment, because the moment was already hers. C-SPAN's camera caught the wide angle. A room half turned, half frozen, anchored by a single figure who had spoken her truth without shouting, and a power that had chosen to walk away from the conversation it could no longer control. In the press gallery above, one journalist whispered to another, "Did she just outlast the speaker?" The other answered, "No, she just made her pause." And that pause, more than anything, told a story. Later, outside the chamber, when reporters scrambled for quotes, none were given. AOC's team issued no statement. Pelosi's office referred all inquiries to official vote transcripts. But on social media, the moment exploded. Clips of the walkout, the silence, the single camera panning from AOC's steady face to Pelosi's retreating figure. Hashtags surged again. Hashtag she stayed. Hashtag power in silence. Hashtag not safe but true. But it was AOC's own words captured without filter that traveled farthest. History isn't made by the safe. It became a headline, a t-shirt, a question asked in classrooms and community centers. What does it mean to be safe? And what does it mean to matter? That line echoed not because it was crafted, but because it was earned, over weeks of exposure, defiance, dignity, and a refusal to disappear. And as the chamber emptied, slowly, quietly, with a new kind of caution in the air, one thing had become clear. Pelosi may have walked out first, but it was AOC who remained. It was the country. The numbers arrived first, quietly like a shift in wind. Then all at once, a poll conducted by Marston and Byrne, one of Washington's most respected nonpartisan firms, showed something unexpected, a 22% increase in public trust for legislators under the age of 45. A deeper look at the data revealed something even more telling. Among independents and older voters, the trust gap between legacy leaders and emerging voices had narrowed for the first time in over a decade. It wasn't a landslide, it was a tectonic slide. The kind you don't see until it starts moving everything else with it. Cable news picked up the numbers within hours. A panel on PBS noted the trend with cautious interest. On CNN, a veteran anchor asked flatly, "Have we just witnessed a generational power fracture on live television?" The question wasn't rhetorical, because in the week following AOC's speech and Pelosi's silent exit, a wave of public re-examination had begun. First came the op-eds. The Chicago Tribune ran the headline, "Time to let go." Pelosi's silence may have spoken the loudest. The Atlantic followed with a piece titled, "Rebels with a Microphone: Why the House Might Need Less Control and More Courage." Even the New York Times, traditionally measured with Democratic leadership, ran a Sunday piece that opened with the line, "The generation that built the machine may now be standing in its way." What stunned many wasn't the shift in tone. It was the openness of the questions. For years, suggestions that Pelosi should step down were buried beneath layers of strategy, politeness, or fear of backlash. But now respected voices in editorial boards and think tanks were saying it aloud. Has leadership become maintenance? And has maintenance become obstruction? Meanwhile, AOC didn't grant interviews. She didn't capitalize on the moment. She returned to her district, met with school teachers, sat in on tenant union meetings, and visited a new food co-op in Queens. But cameras followed her everywhere, not for scandal, but for symbolism. She had, by doing less, become more present than ever before. In contrast, Pelosi remained largely unseen. Her office issued 2 short statements in a week, one about economic forecasts, the other commemorating a historical resolution. Neither referenced the recent floor session. Neither addressed the letter, the speech, or the walkout. And the silence, once a tool of power, now began to feel like absence. In online town halls, voters asked hard questions. In classrooms, civics teachers used AOC's letter to teach democratic accountability. In barbershops and diners, people who rarely talked about Congress found themselves asking, "Did you see what she said?" Or more curiously, why didn't she respond? Because suddenly, silence no longer looked like strength. It looked like surrender. And in this new chapter of political memory, the public wasn't just observing, it was participating by thinking, reacting, and perhaps for the first time in a long time, believing that one voice, if steady enough, could crack the wall. The corridor was empty, the way most powerful spaces become when the cameras leave and the speeches are done. The marble floor stretched long and clean beneath soft lights. Doors were closed. Footsteps were rare. Time itself seemed to walk slower here. But as she turned the corner toward the south exit, she stopped. Nancy Pelosi stood a few steps ahead, alone, thumbing the edge of a folder she hadn't yet tucked into her briefcase. She hadn't heard AOC approach. For just a second, both women stood still, facing one another in the hush of institutional quiet. No reporters, no staff, no angles to manage. Just two women divided by history, connected by position. Pelosi was the one to speak first. Her voice was low, steady, almost too soft for the space. "You're louder than I planned," she said, with no hint of bitterness, only recognition. AOC didn't flinch. She stepped closer, not with confrontation, but with clarity in her posture. "I didn't plan to be loud," she replied. "I planned to be heard." Pelosi looked at her then, really looked. Not as a headline, not as a threat, but as something far harder to name. A moment passed between them that didn't need explanation, because both of them understood what it meant to enter a room knowing most people wished you hadn't. Pelosi gave a faint nod, a gesture that didn't concede but acknowledged. Then she turned and walked away. No final words, no handshakes, just quiet. AOC remained still for a beat longer, listening not to what had been said, but to what had just settled between them. An end, perhaps, or an opening neither of them would see the end of. And when she turned to leave, the corridor behind her felt different, not because of where she was, but because of what she had carried through it. Not volume, conviction. She didn't hurry. Her steps were calm, almost contemplative, as if the silence of the early hour allowed her to finally listen to her own thoughts without interruption. The weight of the past week still lingered on her shoulders. The meetings, the leaks, the ethics hearing, the walkout. But in this moment, it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like clarity. She thought of what had been said about her, that she was too loud, too emotional, too bold, that she didn't play the game the right way. But the truth was, she never wanted to play a game. She wanted to be heard. She remembered the mic that was left on, the words that were never meant to be heard, and the firestorm that followed. And yet she didn't regret any of it. Because silence, she'd come to understand, was never neutral. It could be comforting, but also complicit. And truth didn't need a microphone. It just needed the courage to speak, even when it wasn't convenient. As she glanced back one last time at the Capitol dome, her thoughts formed a quiet conclusion. The mic was never off. You just weren't listening. And with that, she walked forward, into the light, into whatever came next. This story isn't just about politics. It's about courage in the face of tradition and the cost of choosing truth over comfort. AOC's journey reminds us that generational change often begins with quiet resistance and ends with a louder kind of hope. The mic wasn't just left on, it symbolized the voices long ignored, now rising, unfiltered, and unapologetic. Whether you agree with her methods or not, the question stands. What happens when the next generation stops waiting for permission to speak? What about you? Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up? This story is a work of fiction. While inspired by public figures, all characters, events, and dialogues are entirely fictionalized for dramatic and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is purely coincidental. Thank you for walking with us through this journey of voice, silence, and truth. If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply made you think, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Content Alexandria. Rising for more powerful stories that give voice to the unheard. Because sometimes the mic was never off. You were just waiting to hear it.